Hey, oh God, our our chapter was about the Constitution, so that's what we're going to teach you about today.
We're gonna learn y'all some Constitution.
Some Constitution.
Okay, so shall we start with Jamestown and the Mayflower Compact?
I think we shall.
Okay, you can
Okay.
say that first.
So, as you should probably know by now, if you've made it this far, Jamestown was the first permanent settlement in the first permanent English colony in America.
Yes,
And so,
it was a representative assembly, and the legislator was, God, okay,
the legislature was composed of like it was representatives of the population, which is very similar to how ours is now.
Yeah, in the Mayflower Compact, which also you should know was one of the first.
It was like the first official document, form of like government document in America.
It was created by male separatists, and they said it was necessary because of the lack of law and people feared a lack of civil obedience.
Yeah, if you don't have laws, people are just gonna do whatever they want. So you gotta have laws.
Okay. So once we're in the colonies, they had some beef with the British.
Yep.
Okay. So in the 1760s, the British they started doing taxes on the colonies because they wanted to make them help pay the cost of Britain's defense during the French and Indian War.
And so they decided to do that by putting a bunch of taxes on the colonists, such as the Sugar Act, which taxed sugar but taxed other stuff too, like wine, coffee,
other imported goods,
other important things that people need to survive. And then they also had the Stamp Act, which taxed pretty much everything paper, which you kind of also need if you're going to be a colony.
And then they started the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, which they closed the Boston Harbor and put the government of Massachusetts under direct British control. And this was set in place after the Boston Tea Party, which you should also know about, which is
this is the tea. This is the river.
Yeah, so they dumped it in the harbor because they were mad about everything.
After all of the taxes and everything, the colonists were there was some beef. So the colonists were like, you know what? We're tired of Britain. We're gonna start figuring out how we can do this whole governing thing on our own. That's where the First Continental Congress became a thing. And it didn't really do a whole lot other than like the colonists were kind of just like, you know what, Britain kind of sucks. So we should raise our own troops, and also we should boycott British stuff. That way we don't give them any more money.
Mm-hmm. And then they went on to the Second Continental Congress, which took place after like fighting had already started. And there they named George Washington Commander in Chief.
Yep.
That was good. And then next is the Declaration of Independence that came about. And it said that all men have natural, unalienable rights. Wow, that was hard for me to say.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which is a thing from John Locke, English philosopher guy.
Yes.
You should know about him.
And so what else they said in the Declaration of Independence where they just basically complained about King George and talked about how horrible he was all the time. And there was some significance to it, such as
once the Declaration of Independence was a thing, it kind of was like, oh, they're not really the colonies anymore. They're their own country. They have like a legit government. They're an actual nation now.
Mm-hmm.
And once other countries started to recognize them as a nation, they could be like, we're going to give these people money and guns so they can defeat Britain.
They were now eligible to get supplies and military aid to help them in the war against England.
So, before we had the Constitution, we had this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which did not. They sucked. They didn't really do what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, all it did was like it established like a voluntary association of independent states, which isn't really like a country. It's just like a bunch of states that were kind of just like allies, I guess.
It's like a national government, but it couldn't really do a whole lot of governing because
it was so
weak. You couldn't. of the articles, you couldn't call soldiers, you couldn't tax.
Yeah, they didn't have. Yeah, Congress couldn't get revenue, or there were no like system of courts created, and they couldn't draft soldiers and for the army and navy, like she said. But they made it so weak on purpose. It was deliberately weak because back in with King George, they were like the government was so strong and controlling. They came to America and they were like, "Hey, we hate that. Let's make a thing where we're all in charge." And they did, and it sucked. Okay, but also they had some accomplishments,
such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which basically abolished slavery in the Northwest Territories. And then, the middle class became a thing, and they were, more involved in politics. And then it kind of negotiated the treaty that ended the war. It provided, it gave America, the people to go to when they needed people to do things like negotiate treaties and stuff like that.
And so it made the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. And then, in addition to all of that, it set precedents for federalism. And federalism is the separation of power between state and local governments. So they shared governing responsibilities, but that was it wasn't really a huge thing like it is today with the Constitution, but it started to be a thing. Okay, now we're going to talk about Shays' Rebellion, which was the farmers rebelling because of all the people that the government had imprisoned because of debts. And everybody was going crazy. They were bugging out. No, that was good.
That's good.
And during this, the government wasn't able to keep peace and order, and that's because of the weak plan of government they had. So
they were like, we're going to go back to the drawing board. And that's where they came up with the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan.
Yeah.
So the Virginia Plan, basically, this is how you can remember, Virginia Plan, big states. Virginia is a big state. So they wanted the new form of government, representation to be decided by population.
Yeah. So that favored large states because they're bigger, so they have a bigger population, Yeah. And they wanted the lower chamber. They wanted a bicameral legislature too, that's where the legislative branch of government is separated into two things,
The lower chamber was going to be decided by the people, and then the people in the lower chamber were going to decide the people in the bigger one.
Yeah. Okay.
Upper one.
And so, contrastly, the New Jersey plan was proposed, and the small states favored this plan because they wanted this would have a constant number of representations for each state, and under this they would determine all acts of Congress to be final, which proposed the supremacy clause, where national law trumps state law.
And so, because both of these plans, they couldn't really agree on what they wanted to do, this is where the Great Compromise came in.
And also known as the Connecticut Compromise.
Yeah. So, basically, they decided there was still going to be a bicameral legislature. So there were still going to be two houses. The lower house, the House of Representatives, was going to be decided, on population, like the Virginia plan.
Yeah.
And the Senate, the upper chamber, was going to be decided.
It would have two representatives.
Every state.
Each state. And under all this, they brought up slaves again, and they made the 3/5 compromise, which determined that 3/5 of the slave population will count towards legislative representation in the House of Representatives. So that was dumb, but the rest of it was pretty good because we still use it today.
So when they were making all these compromises and all this legislature, they were like, how are we going to keep all of the power in the government from being in one place so we don't end up like Britain?
Yeah. So they made checks and balances. And that's where one branch of government, judicial, legislative, executive, which you should know, one branch can have a check or a power over another branch, so that each branch, there won't be one that gets too strong and has all the power.
Examples: Congress can make the laws, but the president is the one who can veto them or sign them into law.
Okay, and another example is the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional, but the president is the one who appoints the judges. So there's that. And then there's other powers, which are concurrent powers and reserve powers. Concurrent powers are the powers that are shared by federal and state governments, like collecting taxes, building roads, operating courts, borrowing money, and such things.
There's also reserve powers, which are the powers reserved to the states. That's the 10th Amendment. Yeah. And so that's things like issuing licenses, interstate commerce, running, paying for federal elections, stuff like that.
And then, on this time, September 17th, 1789, the Constitution was approved, but not ratified.
Not ratified yet.
Not ratified. So the Federalists were the writers and supporters of the Constitution, and they are the ones who attended the Constitutional Conference. And the Anti-Federalists were obviously the ones who were against, hence the against the ratification of the Constitution. And they appealed to people who favored the status quo and were against change, which were a lot of people back in the day.
So, in order to get the Constitution ratified, some dudes, Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, came up with this thing called the Federalist Papers. And it was basically it was a series of essays anonymously written by the public, defending the document of the public from Hamilton.
Yeah.
You'll know that. So it was about why
it defended the Constitution.
Yeah, there's that.
And it was like, hey, it's pretty good. And it was trying to be like,
it's cool.
Gain support for the Constitution. So those were published, and the Anti-Federalists responded to the Constitution. Responded to the Federalist Papers. They were like, hey, the Constitution was written by rich people, aristocrats, so that would obviously lead to tyranny. And they were like, hey, if the central government gets so powerful, then they wouldn't have personal liberties like when King George was their ruler guy.
Yep. And so, you want to talk about the election?
Go for it.
Okay. So basically, how they got the Anti-Federalists to be like, okay, the Constitution's okay, it's fine, it's whatever.
Yeah.
They did this. They made this thing called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights includes the rights of the people that can't be taken
First
away.
10 amendments.
First 10 amendments. Those are the rights that cannot be taken away by the government.
Yeah. So the Federalists were like, hey guys, nobody's going to get their individual liberties taken away with this thing, and it just basically limits government power.
Yeah.
So, and that was essential to getting the Constitution ratified. Okay. Also, now we're going to talk about amending the Constitution, and that's just changing it, which are called amendments.
Yeah. There's 26?
27
of those. And obviously, we had to have more than just... Obviously, there's been more made since... Proposed.
Yeah.
Ratified. That.
Okay, and so there's a process to proposing and ratifying it. And to propose an amendment, you can either have 2/3 of House and Senate approve it, or propose it, sorry. Or 2/3 of the states call for a convention about an issue. And then to ratify the amendment, 3/4 of state legislators have to, legislatures agree with the proposal, or 3/4 of the state at the convention have to agree on it. And so then that gets slapped onto the Constitution.
Yep. And then there's also informal methods of change that are faster, but they happen.
They get the job done.
Congress can pass legislation. The president can do executive orders and stuff like that.
Executive orders have the same effect as laws,
Yep.
but they don't need Congress to approve it. And then there's also executive agreements, which are the same as treaties, but the Senate doesn't need to approve it either.
And there's also judicial review, which is basically where the Supreme Court can go back and look at a case or a law and stuff like that and be like,
that goes
not
against the
cool.
Constitution.
So, also in the Constitution, there are these things called clauses, and one of them is the full faith and credit clause, where states are required by the Constitution to accept documents issued by other states. So, if your license is an Indiana license, you can still drive in Kentucky with it and not get arrested for it. Like,
Yeah.
it's valid in all 50 states.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that clause is about.
Yes. Okay, and then another one is a privileges and immunities clause, where other states can't refuse police protection or access to their courts to another citizen just because they reside in a different state. That's not fair.
Yeah.
And there's this thing called extradition, where states must return fugitives, criminals, whatever, from other states if they're like running away from it to escape whatever. And they have to like send them back to the other state that they ran away from. And then there's
there's also the supremacy clause, where it's basically like in conflict between federal law and state law, federal law always wins.
yeah,
Always.
Now we're going to talk about some of the amendments, which are pretty important. You need to learn, like, you need to know all these.
You should know these.
Yeah, there's 27 of them, and they're really important for the test or the exam, because you kind of just have to know how to apply it to questions. They'll just ask you questions. How does which amendment is about suffrage, things like that.
Also, these are your actual literal rights. Like, you should probably know
Yeah.
these.
These are important. Okay, and so we're going to start with the First Amendment, which includes the freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, and petition. And that also includes the Establishment Clause, which is another clause that we didn't mention before, where Congress can't establish a national official church of the United States. That's unconstitutional, my friends.
Yep. There's the Second Amendment, where it's the right to bear arms and also guns.
Shut up. Okay, the Third Amendment has it started as no quartering soldiers, which was like a big deal back in the day, but now it's basically it was the foundation to the right to privacy, which was further implemented by Griswold versus Connecticut. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then there's the Fourth Amendment, which also goes along with the right to privacy, is no unreasonable search and seizure. So if you get pulled over or something and the police officer's like, let me search your vehicle, they can't make you do that unless they have a warrant.
Yeah. So that's the exclusionary rule. That kind of goes with the exclusionary rule, which is present in this amendment.
Yep.
Where evidence, like, if the police officers are, like, looking in your house or whatever and they don't have a warrant, they can't, like, confiscate evidence or whatever. They can't get it without a warrant and then use it in courts. That's unconstitutional again.
The case that you'll hear this the most with would be Mapp versus Ohio, where the mounds of porn.
Mounds of porn.
Where the police were like, we're going to confiscate this porn.
But they didn't have a warrant.
They didn't have a warrant, so they couldn't use it in the trial, so that lady got off scot-free.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to go to the Fifth Amendment, which is no self-incrimination and no double jeopardy. So that's like when you hear people yelling, I plead the Fifth.
Yeah.
So there's that.
The Sixth Amendment is your right to counsel, your right to a speedy public trial, stuff like that. That's like the basis of habeas corpus, where they're like, they have to tell you what you've been arrested for. They can't just throw you in jail and not tell you.
Yeah, and it has to be like, that goes along with speedy trial, because you can't just be in prison forever, like waiting for your court date. It has to be like within a certain amount of time. You can't be in there forever.
And this goes along with Miranda versus Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
That's where your Miranda rights come from.
Yes. Okay, and the Seventh Amendment is it guarantees jury trials for lawsuits over $20, which used to be a lot of money, but that's just it's just a thing. Okay.
Yeah, it's a thing. But the Eighth Amendment is that no cruel or unusual punishment, and like that also goes along with no excessive fines or bail fees.
Yeah. The Ninth Amendment it refers to laws that exist beyond what is explicitly stated in the Constitution. And the rights that aren't like explicitly stated in the Constitution are still protected. Like you can't be forbidden to brush your hair just because it's not stated in the Constitution, but
you can't be like, that's not in the Constitution, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Because you can do that.
Yes.
Even if it doesn't say so.
Yeah. You can brush your hair.
You can.
Okay.
Brush that hair. There's also the 10th Amendment, which says that there are powers reserved to the states. So,
Yeah.
There's that.
The 11th Amendment, citizens can't sue a state they don't reside in.
Yep. The 12th Amendment was the creation of the Electoral College. It's basically the representatives who pick, who elect the president, basically.
Mhm.
It's some of your representatives from each state and state senators that make up the Electoral College.
The 13th Amendment is the first Civil War Amendment, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
You should know those.
The 13th is the abolition. Oh my God. Abolition of slavery. The 14th is citizenship and equal protection under the law.
That's important. You'll hear that one a lot.
Yes, you should know them. 15th Amendment is voting rights extended to all men. So
Yep.
that's like African American people, you know. And that was good. Yep.
Good thing. The 16th Amendment made income taxes a thing. So there's that.
And the 17th was the direct election of senators.
That's cool. The 18th Amendment was the Prohibition Amendment. And so that banned alcohol consumption, which made a lot of people very upset, but also made a lot of people happy. But that's not a thing anymore, so it doesn't really matter anymore.
And the 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. They were allowed to vote now, kind of. And then the 20th?
The 20th Amendment is the lame duck amendment, where, like, is that an ice cream truck? Oh my god, okay. So it used to be that, like, inauguration took place in, like, what was it, like March or something.
Yeah.
But, like, you had to have a president while Congress was in session. Otherwise, no laws were going to get passed. So they pushed the inauguration date up to January, I think it is now, so that
stuff can get done.
So stuff can get done.
Okay, and the 21st got rid of prohibition. Man, I can't do it. They got rid of prohibition because everybody was mad about it, and they were doing it anyways. They liked their alcohol.
Prohibition doesn't work, fam.
Yep.
The 22nd Amendment was where they limited presidential terms to 2 terms, 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's that.
And the 23rd allowed D.C. residents to vote in presidential elections because they weren't before, which is kind of weird.
Yeah. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes, which was a good thing because poll taxes were keeping a lot of people from voting. Like, that's not cool.
Not cool. And the 25th Amendment gave power to the vice president if the president gets sick, like, or he's physically unable to fulfill his duties, which is also known as presidential disability.
There's a thing in West Wing about that somewhere.
Yeah. Okay.
The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18.
Because they said by the time you're 18, you can be drafted to the military, so you should be able to vote for the country.
Yep.
Wait, for the country, vote for the country. The 27th Amendment allowed congressional pay raises. The Congress could give themselves pay raises.